the man behind London's most feared crime family. How does a man go from the rough streets of North London to becoming one of the most powerful and feared crime bosses in British history? Terry Adams wasn't just another gangster. He was the mastermind behind the infamous Clerkenwell crime syndicate, better known as the Adams family. Unlike the flashy, reckless criminals that dominated headlines, Adams operated in complete secrecy, making him nearly untouchable for decades. With his brothers by his side, he built an empire that controlled London's underworld, raking in hundreds of millions through drug trafficking, extortion, and money laundering. Even MI5 struggled to take him down. But despite his high-profile conviction, many believe the real story isn't over. Did Terry Adams truly lose everything? Or is he still pulling the strings from the shadows? The truth about Terry Adams is far more complex than it seems, and what really happened to his hidden millions might just shock you. Terry Adams was born in 1954 in Islington, North London, the eldest of 11 siblings in a large Irish Catholic family. Growing up in a tough, working-class environment, he quickly learned how to navigate the unforgiving streets of North London, where crime wasn't just an option, it was a way of life. But unlike the reckless street criminals around him, Adams was calculated, disciplined, and highly intelligent. He wasn't interested in petty theft or getting into bar fights. He had his sights set on something much bigger. Even as a teenager, Adams showed a natural talent for leadership. He understood that power didn't come from being the loudest or the most violent. It came from being the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. While others were content with quick money from low-level robberies, Adams was thinking ahead, plotting how to build a criminal empire that could last. By the late 1970s, alongside his younger brothers Patrick and Tommy, Adams started assembling a network of criminals. Unlike other gangs that relied on brute force, the Adams brothers ran things like a business. They focused on organized crime, where the real money was drug trafficking, extortion, arms dealing, and money laundering. This wasn't just another street gang. They were building something far more sophisticated. It wasn't long before their operation became known as the Clerkenwell crime syndicate, but the streets had a simpler name for them: the Adams family. Unlike high-profile criminals like the Cray twins, who craved media attention, the Adams family kept things deadly silent. They knew that secrecy was their greatest weapon, and they used it to their advantage. Throughout the 1980s, the Adams family rapidly expanded their reach, building an underground empire worth millions. Their brutal efficiency, extreme secrecy, and ability to eliminate threats made them one of the most feared criminal organizations in Britain. If someone crossed them, they didn't just disappear from London, they disappeared for good. But this was only the beginning. Terry Adams wasn't just another gangster, he was a mastermind, and the real rise of the Adams family was just about to begin. By the 1980s, the Adams family was no longer just another London gang. They were a full-scale criminal syndicate, running operations with military-like precision. Terry Adams, the undisputed leader, ruled not with reckless violence, but with absolute control. His brothers, Patrick and Tommy, played key roles. Patrick was the enforcer, handling security and eliminating threats, while Tommy managed financial operations, ensuring the syndicate's wealth remained well hidden. The Adams family's influence spread like wildfire, and soon, they controlled vast portions of London's underworld. Their business wasn't just about survival, it was about domination, and they had their hands in almost every profitable criminal activity imaginable. Drug trafficking. The syndicate established direct connections to Colombian and Moroccan cartels, smuggling massive quantities of high-purity cocaine and heroin into the UK. Unlike street dealers, they operated at a wholesale level, supplying major distributors across London. Arms dealing. They weren't just moving drugs, they were also linked to the illegal weapons trade, supplying firearms to criminal groups and even suspected of arms deals with factions in Northern Ireland's paramilitary conflicts. Extortion and protection rackets. The Adams family controlled nightclubs, pubs, and businesses across London, forcing owners to pay for protection under the unspoken threat of extreme violence. Those who refused quickly regretted it. Money laundering. Unlike other gangsters who flaunted their wealth, Adams knew better. Millions were laundered through front businesses, including high-end fashion companies, antique dealerships, and luxury car sales. Some of this dirty money even made its way into legitimate real estate investments. A crime syndicate unlike any other. What made the Adams family so dangerous wasn't just their reach, it was their code of silence. Terry Adams operated like a mafia boss, ensuring that no one spoke out against them. The gang's members were handpicked, fiercely loyal, and sworn to secrecy. If anyone was suspected of cooperating with authorities, they vanished without a trace. Unlike the Crays or the Richardsons, who craved publicity, the Addams family understood that true power comes from the shadows. They never left a paper trail, rarely spoke on the phone, and avoided flashy displays of wealth. Even law enforcement struggled to collect solid evidence. For years, they knew the Addams family was running London, but they couldn't prove it. By the 1990s, the Addams family's empire was estimated to be worth over £200 million, with deep connections to international crime networks. Terry Addams had transformed from a local gangster into a global crime boss, operating at the highest levels of organized crime. But with power came attention. The authorities knew they couldn't allow the Addams family to continue unchecked. MI5, Scotland Yard, and the National Crime Squad were closing in, determined to bring down London's most untouchable crime syndicate. And that's when everything started to unravel. By the 1990s, Terry Addams wasn't just a crime boss, he was living like a billionaire businessman. Unlike other gangsters who flaunted their wealth with gold chains and flashy cars, Addams took a different approach. He wanted to reinvent himself, stepping out of the shadows and into high society, rubbing shoulders with celebrities, politicians, and the British elite. He swapped the gritty streets of Islington for a £2 million mansion in North London, complete with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and a personal art collection worth a fortune. His taste for the finer things was no secret. He owned handmade suits from Savile Row, expensive watches, and even a collection of luxury cars, including Bentleys and Rolls-Royces. To the outside world, he wasn't a feared crime boss. He was a successful businessman with impeccable taste. The cover-up, a legitimate businessman. To complete his transformation, Addams set up a string of high-end front businesses, using them to launder millions in criminal profits. His ventures included antique dealing. He invested in rare antiques, using them to hide vast sums of money. Fashion and jewelry. Some reports suggest he had stakes in luxury brands, using them as financial cover. Music industry. He even dabbled in music management, allegedly trying to clean his image by backing up-and-coming artists. This wasn't just about hiding dirty money, it was about rewriting his identity. He wanted to be seen as a refined, respectable gentleman, a man who had left his criminal past behind. But behind the suits and the wealth, nothing had really changed. The Addams family was still running multi-million-pound drug deals, extortion rackets, and money laundering schemes. The only difference was that now, Terry Addams wanted to operate like a mafia don, using influence instead of brute force. Living like a king, but under watchful eyes. Despite his efforts to blend in, Addams' lavish lifestyle raised suspicions. Law enforcement agencies knew that someone who had never held a legitimate job shouldn't be living like royalty. MI5, Scotland Yard, and the National Crime Squad started watching closely, determined to find evidence linking him to his empire. For years, Addams had been untouchable, carefully avoiding direct involvement in criminal activities. But as law enforcement tightened the noose, the walls started closing in. His extravagant lifestyle had painted a target on his back, one he wouldn't be able to escape. And soon, his carefully constructed facade would come crashing down. For years, Terry Addams had outsmarted the law, building a criminal empire that operated in near-complete secrecy. Unlike the loud and reckless gangsters who eventually got themselves caught, Addams was meticulous. No phone calls, no written records, no loose ends. Even Scotland Yard, the National Crime Squad, and the serious organised crime agency, SOCA, struggled to pin anything on him. But by the late 1990s, law enforcement had had enough. The Addams family was too big, too powerful, and too dangerous to ignore. With an estimated £200 million empire built on drug trafficking, extortion, and arms deals, the British government saw them as a direct threat to national security. That's when MI5 got involved. The surveillance operation. MI5, Britain's secret intelligence service, typically focuses on counter-terrorism and espionage, not organised crime. But Terry Addams was no ordinary gangster. His influence extended far beyond London's underworld, with links to international cartels, financial fraud, and even suspected arms deals with paramilitary groups. A top-level investigation was launched, with MI5 and the National Crime Squad working together to crack the Addams family's code of silence. The strategy was clear. Intercept communications. Since Addams never used phones, investigators began monitoring his associates, lawyers, and financial handlers. Follow the money. Law enforcement started digging into the Addams family's web of front businesses, offshore accounts, and hidden assets. Turn insiders. Authorities applied pressure on lower-level syndicate members, hoping someone would break ranks and talk. Despite their best efforts, Addams remained elusive, and direct evidence against him was still hard to find. He had spent decades operating in the shadows, and his low-profile lifestyle made it nearly impossible to link him to specific crimes. The first cracks appear. In the early 2000s, investigators got their first break. A series of high-profile arrests within the Addams family network began putting pressure on their financial operations. With the heat increasing, Addams made a crucial mistake. He became personally involved in trying to launder his fortune. Authorities discovered that Addams had been using fake companies, fraudulent loans, and offshore accounts to clean millions in dirty money. A secret investigation into his finances, Operation Trinity, finally provided the evidence needed to take him down. In 2003, after decades of avoiding the law, Addams was arrested. But would they finally be able to convict him? Or would he find a way to escape justice once again? After decades of ruling London's underworld, Terry Addams finally found himself cornered. The authorities had spent years trying to nail him for drug trafficking, extortion, and murder, but Addams had always been careful. No paper trails, no direct evidence, no loose ends. But his one fatal mistake wasn't violence or racketeering, it was money laundering. By the early 2000s, Operation Trinity had exposed how Addams had been moving millions through a complex web of fake companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent loans. Unlike his past crimes, financial fraud left a paper trail, and this time, there was no way out. The courtroom showdown. In 2007, Terry Addams finally faced justice at the Old Bailey, one of Britain's most famous criminal courts. But in a move that shocked many, Addams pleaded guilty, not to murder or drug trafficking, but to money laundering. His legal team tried to play down his past, painting him as a retired businessman who had left his criminal life behind. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They described Addams as one of the most significant organized criminals in the UK, a man who had spent his life profiting from crime and staying one step ahead of the law. The sentence. The verdict was clear. Terry Addams was sentenced to 7 years in prison and ordered to pay back £4.7 million of his illicit fortune. For a man who had built an empire worth over £200 million, the sentence seemed almost light. But Addams had no choice. Facing the possibility of an even longer sentence, he had to accept the deal. Even behind bars, Addams didn't break character. He refused to admit the full extent of his crimes, claiming he had gone legit years ago. But the authorities knew better. His conviction may have been for financial crimes, but it was clear that they had finally taken down one of Britain's most powerful crime lords. Life after prison. Was it really the end? After serving his time, Addams was released in 2012, but his problems were far from over. The government wasn't done with him. In 2017, he was forced to pay another £700,000, or risk going back to prison. Gone were the luxury cars, million-pound mansions, and designer suits. Struggling to pay his debts, Addams claimed he was broke and living off his wife's salary as a yoga instructor, but few believed him. Investigators suspected that much of his fortune was still hidden, stashed away in offshore accounts or controlled through trusted associates. Legacy of a crime boss. Terry Addams may no longer be at the top, but the Addams family's influence never fully disappeared. Even today, whispers of their operations still linger in the London underworld. His conviction marked the end of an era, but the legend of Terry Addams, the man who built one of Britain's most feared crime syndicates, will never be forgotten. When Terry Addams walked free in 2012, many assumed that his days of luxury and power were over. The man who once ruled London's underworld, who dined with celebrities and moved millions through offshore accounts, now claimed to be flat broke. But was he really? Or was this just another carefully crafted deception? After his release, Addams tried to paint himself as a changed man. He insisted that his criminal past was behind him and that he had no money left, not a penny from his old empire. His legal team claimed he was living off his wife's modest income as a yoga instructor, struggling to make ends meet. The man who once owned £2 million mansions, rare art collections, and a fleet of luxury cars now claimed to be a humble, retired ex-convict. He said he couldn't even afford a mobile phone. To many, it was laughable, a crime boss who ran a £200 million syndicate suddenly penniless. The government isn't buying it. Authorities never believed Addams' sob story. They suspected that millions were still hidden, stashed in offshore accounts or controlled through secret business interests. And they weren't about to let him walk away with it. In 2017, the National Crime Agency, NCA, took him back to court, demanding he pay another £700,000 to settle his debts. They argued that he still had access to huge hidden assets, despite his claims of being broke. Addams, however, continued to plead poverty, saying he couldn't afford to pay. But the judge wasn't convinced. He ruled that Adams either came up with the money or went back to prison. And just like that, the supposedly bankrupt crime boss magically found the cash. Where did the money come from? This sudden payment only fueled suspicions that Adams still had access to his secret fortune. Investigators believed that he had spent years hiding his wealth, moving it through trusted associates, offshore accounts, and luxury assets that couldn't be traced back to him. Some reports suggest he had silent stakes in businesses, allowing him to keep earning money under the radar. Others believe that Adams still had millions hidden abroad, untouched by authorities. There were even rumors that he had connections with international criminals, helping him move and protect his fortune. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear: Terry Adams was no ordinary bankrupt man. These days, Adams keeps a low profile. He no longer lives in luxury mansions or attends high-end parties. Instead, he stays out of the spotlight, claiming to be a reformed man. But many in law enforcement aren't convinced. They believe he's simply playing the long game, waiting for the heat to die down before accessing his hidden millions. His brothers, Patrick and Tommy Adams, have also faced legal troubles, but the Adams family name still carries weight in the London underworld. Some say their influence never truly disappeared, just went underground. So, is Terry Adams truly broke? Or has he managed to pull off his most impressive trick yet, hiding millions while convincing the world he has nothing? One thing is for sure: if anyone could get away with it, it's him. Terry Adams' so-called downfall was supposed to mark the end of one of Britain's most feared crime bosses. A man who built an empire on violence, drugs, and extortion had finally been caught, convicted, and stripped of his fortune. Or so the authorities claimed. But was it really the end? Or was this just another illusion, a carefully orchestrated retreat rather than a true defeat? When Adams was sentenced in 2007, the authorities presented it as a huge victory against organized crime. The media framed him as a broken man, forced into financial ruin. He was stripped of his wealth, publicly humiliated, and left to live a quiet life in retirement. But many who followed his story knew better. This wasn't the dramatic fall of a crime kingpin. Adams was never convicted for his most serious crimes: murder, drug trafficking, arms dealing. Instead, the authorities could only pin money laundering on him, a charge that barely scratched the surface of his criminal empire. His 7-year sentence was nothing compared to the decades of power he had built. Despite his supposed retirement, whispers in the underworld suggest that Adams' influence never fully disappeared. The Adams family syndicate didn't crumble after his conviction, it simply adapted. His brothers, Patrick and Tommy, continued to operate in the shadows, with both facing legal trouble in later years. Investigators suspect that Adams still has trusted associates running businesses, laundering money, and keeping assets hidden. His legendary code of silence remains intact. Unlike other crime families that collapsed due to informants, the Adams family has kept its secrets. And then there's the money. If Adams was truly bankrupt, how did he suddenly pay back £700,000 in 2017 when faced with a return to prison? His claim of living off his wife's yoga instructor's salary seemed laughable to those who knew his past. Many believe Adams' downfall was more of a strategic retreat than an actual defeat. He knew that staying in the spotlight was dangerous, and the best way to hold on to power was to let the world believe he was finished. By playing the role of a reformed man, Adams successfully removed the pressure from law enforcement. While other gangsters continued to make headlines and land themselves in prison for violent crimes, Adams was laying low, staying quiet, and, some suspect, still enjoying the benefits of his past empire. Whether Adams is truly out of the game or simply operating from the shadows, one thing is certain: his legacy is far from over. The Adams family remains one of the most feared crime syndicates in British history, and even if Terry Adams is no longer at the helm, his name still carries weight. So, did Terry Adams really lose it all? Or did he pull off one final, brilliant deception, convincing the world he was powerless while still controlling everything from the shadows? For a man who built an empire on secrecy and strategy, the truth may never fully come to light. Terry Adams' story is one of power, secrecy, and deception. A man who built an empire in the shadows, evaded justice for decades, and then seemingly disappeared into obscurity. But has he truly vanished, or is he still pulling the strings from the shadows? Despite his conviction, Adams never faced justice for the most serious crimes tied to his name. The murders, drug deals, and extortion schemes that built his empire remain largely unproven in court, allowing him to walk away with a fraction of the punishment many expected. And while the authorities insist that they stripped him of his wealth, the sudden appearance of hundreds of thousands of pounds years after his release suggests otherwise. To the public, he is now a retired businessman, a man who claims to be broke, living quietly with his wife. But to those who understand the underworld, Adam's story is far from over. His name still carries weight, and whispers suggest that the Addams family syndicate never truly fell. It just adapted, evolving into a newer, smarter, and even harder to trace version of itself. So, what's the truth? Was Terry Addams truly brought down by the system, or did he orchestrate his own great escape, ensuring that his empire would continue long after the world believed he was finished? One thing is certain, when it comes to Terry Addams, the full story may never be known.